Well, hello and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Tampa Bay History Center's signature lecture series, Florida Conversations. This program is free and open to the public thanks to the support of the University of South Florida Endowment, USF Libraries, AARP Tampa, and a generous gift from Shelley Blood. If you're joining us on Zoom, please use the Q&A function to submit questions throughout the program. For our in-person guests, please wait for a microphone before asking your question so it can be shared with the full audience. We'll have time for questions at the end of today's presentation. For information about other upcoming programs and events, including the 5th Annual Black History Month reception on Friday, February 27th, please visit tampabayhistorycenter.org. And now, please join me in welcoming the History Center's Director of Curatorial Affairs, Michelle Hearn.
So it's my honor today to be able to introduce our speaker, Roda Ferraro. Real quick, though, I'd like to give a shout out to Tammy Gant, who's here from Ocala and the Florida Thoroughbred Breeders Association. I probably said that wrong, but she helped us so much with that exhibit and all her research, and we really appreciate it. Roda is the curator of the Heart of the Turf Racing's Black Pioneer exhibit. Roda Ferraro also has a book on sale in the gift store by the same name. She pursued her undergraduate studies at Emory University and graduate studies in Indiana University before years of teaching and research at Vanderbilt University and the University of Kentucky. She holds a master's degree in Library and Information Sciences from the University of Kentucky. Ferraro has more than 25 years' experience in learning, assessing, promoting library, museum, research, and educational services, including, of course, her work with Keeneland Library and the National Museum of Racing and Hall of Fame since 2014. She also has been of great assistance to us at the History Center in helping with the Sport of Kings and Queens exhibit, sending us high-res photos of jockeys Julie Crone and Diane Crump. And on that note, I think Nancy Turner, who's the co-curator of the exhibit, The Sport of Kings and Queens, and also co-author of the upcoming book, The First 100 Years of Tampa Bay Downs, would like to say a few words about Roda. Do you want to come up here? You have to speak into the microphone. Because we're podcasting.
Oh, okay. Roda has really been invaluable, and I had the good fortune to go meet Diane Crump, who was the first woman to ride in the Kentucky Derby. We were both born in 1948, so we had a kindred spirit. And she lent me her saddle, and they're upstairs in the exhibit. Her saddle, her boots, her helmet, her goggles, her pants. They all had the names of the jockeys in the pants. I guess if they ended up face down, you'd know who it was in the track, but also her silks. And I became very fond of her, and this is a shout out to Roda because she, this year, it was in June, wasn't it, or July? They celebrated her 55th anniversary of her ride at Churchill Downs. And I've kind of figured out later, it was in 1970 that she rode at the Kentucky Derby, but the guy who won, and she started here in Tampa, actually Oldsmar, and at Tampa Bay Downs, but so did a guy named Mike Manganello. And they were both in the 1970 Kentucky Derby, and finally it dawned on me that had happened, and I called Diane. I said, Diane, did you know Mike? And she said, no, I didn't. Not then, but she said in casual conversation, we realized we had both been in the Kentucky Derby. Mike won. He came in first. Diane came in second to last. But, it didn't matter. But she was such a wonderful woman. And when they were celebrating her ride and her birthday, Mike lives in Lexington or nearby, and he and his whole family came to celebrate with her. Isn't that wonderful? And unfortunately, Diane died New Year's Day this year. But she did a good job with her life. Well, thank you.
Okay. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Roda Ferraro. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for such a warm welcome. I am going to put this out there now before we get started because I know that it's going to be something that I forget to do. For everybody who is here attending in person, and we'll leave all of the extra handbills with the center to share with visitors. I want to leave this, I'm just going to place them here, and after we will distribute them to folks because this is just a little handbill that covers the heart of the turf. Just a nice exhibit synopsis, but what I really want to leave it here for is that you all will have a URL where you could tap into some of the video interviews and some of the supplemental materials that support the exhibit, and as long as you have internet connectivity, you can freely tap into those resources. So this is being left here primarily for that URL, all right? So again, at the end of the talk, we'll distribute these. We'll leave them here for now. But please help me remember that that's something that I want to make sure that we get to all of you. I am Roda Ferraro, as everybody was so generous to share with you, and I'm director of Keeneland Library. As Michelle noted, I've been at that library, which is the world's largest repository of information and image resources tied to the thoroughbred industry. So we work with folks all over the world every day because our collections are just so niche. We work with the general public, we work with academics, we work really heavily with media, both mainstream media and media that closely follows sporting events and the sport of racing in particular. We work with racetracks and horse farms all over the world in their communications campaign. So if you ever have any questions tied to the industry, we don't have everything at Keeneland Library, but we have a lot. And I was sharing with folks upstairs before we got started today that just in terms of images alone, we have about 5 million photographs in Keeneland Library collections that document the history of the sport in North America primarily, but also at racetracks and farms internationally. That just kind of gives you a sense of the richness, I think, and the depth of those collections. So feel free to reach out at any time. Most of our collections are in print. So we have this unique challenge of working with 95% of our research patrons remotely, but what we're sharing with those folks is in a building in print. So we're meeting people where they are, talking through their projects, what drives that need, and we then scan and send what is relevant out to folks, including information resources. So I mentioned the image resources, but information resources, we've got articles and books covering the sport dating from the late 1500s all the way to the present. So do reach out. Again, we don't have it all, but we love to share what we have. So moving on to Heart of the Turf specifically. Heart of the Turf has been traveling the country. We are so grateful to Tammy for getting it to Ocala this past fall and for the Tampa Bay History Center for bringing it here, being able to share it with folks that visit this lovely center through May. The exhibit sits just outside the gallery that Michelle had referenced upstairs. Is it the third floor? Yes, so be sure to check out the exhibit that is in that gallery space and the Heart of the Turf, which kind of rides that hallway just outside that gallery space. So for folks who need to tune into the exhibit content when upstairs and want to take that content in a different way other than reading it, there are QR codes on every one of those interpretive panel sides, and that would take you to an audio guide segment, essentially, for that exhibit. So those are kind of the logistics of the exhibit itself. Now I want to talk about the Heart of the Turf, Racing's Black Pioneers, and the fact that it covers, we say 100 Black horsemen and women from enslavement to the present. In reality, the exhibit touches on lives of closer to 125 people. And those folks who are featured in the exhibit are just a very small representative sample of the thousands of people who have worked in various capacities across thoroughbred breeding and racing. And the exhibit starts firmly during the era of enslavement, and the content brings us through the Civil War, through the Reconstruction years, through Jim Crow, the Civil Rights Movement, and beyond to today. So the exhibit covers quite a lot of turf. I do mean that pun. It's kind of funny. So more than 200 years, and even though a lot of the folks I'm going to spotlight today are jockeys, the exhibit does showcase the variety of jobs across the industry, from folks that maybe aren't as visible, working on horse farms, working on the backside of racetracks, past and present, to owners, breeders, household names, superstar athletes, headline makers, and those headlines being made by young black men during enslavement, when young black men weren't typically making headlines for being a hero of anything in particular, certainly not something specific like horse racing. So we'll talk about all of this. It's a lot of territory to cover in the amount of time we have. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to delve into any one thing with a lot of detail, but know that there's far more to take in upstairs. There's far more to take in the companion book. And there's far more to take in online if you all pick up this handbill and have that URL to point to some of those online resources. Also, remember, reach out to us at any point in time if you have follow-up questions about how this could relate to your locality, and for tips, advice on digging into more local stories. That's what we do at the library, and if we don't have it, we will do our best to connect you to local archives and repositories that do, okay? So, the exhibit, like I said, covers roughly 100 lives, and it was very important to us as we made selections about who would be featured in the exhibit that we did show the depth and breadth of contributions over time, because the thoroughbred industry has been, from the founding of this country and through the years leading us to about the World War period, a very, very prominent sport. A huge influencer economically and culturally. And to know that sport in southern states was sustained almost entirely on the backs of enslaved boys and men is a very important foundation base to have when we're considering the thoroughbred industry as a whole, particularly because so much of the breeding did occur and racing did occur in the South in states where enslavement was on their books as being lawful. So we wanted to show the depth and breadth of contributions over time. We also wanted to bring people through time and know that you're just getting a little biographical vignette of these folks that are featured in the exhibit. But those vignettes, if you read that narrative from start to finish in the exhibit, they are rooted in larger cultural, economic, political context of the time. So, you might be looking at a panel and see something about anti-gambling legislation that swept this country in the early 1900s, because that had a big impact on racing as a whole. So, of course, it would also have a big impact on who was the workforce at the time. You're going to see mention of Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1896 Supreme Court ruling, where our Supreme Court in this country said, hey, all you southern states with segregation laws on your books, we're gonna deem those constitutional. That's the beginning of when we start to see racetracks as a public space and presence in a community being segregated for the first time. So we're gonna talk about the civil rights movement. So you may see reference to laws or big economic trends. Well, these folks are representative not only of the work and the contributions in the industry, but their capacity in terms of what they were able to do in this sport, being dictated by when they were born and where they were born in the last 200 years, okay? So let me get my little clicker. It's so hard for me to stand behind this podium and not move, I'll just tell you. And so if you see me drifting, call me back, because that folks tuning in can hear as well. I think I'm going to put this up a bit. So I want to talk a little bit about a track. If I turn sideways, can you still hear me okay? A track that lived in what is now Lexington's East End. Again, this track was chosen as a case study, and my hope is that it's a catalyst of research that can be conducted in other parts of the country. Because what was happening around this track before and after the Civil War is really emblematic of the evolution of racing on a broader context. And these stories are embedded in all locales' history. Wherever there's a geographic region with a racetrack who is operating at this point in time, remember these themes, these challenges, these stories from racing, good, bad, ugly, and otherwise, were there, and they all have this local presence. It is not the easiest thing to research. This is a very hard time period to research in terms of what records are publicly available. And as a rule, if you look at racing results from when this country started tracking racing results to the present, you are sometimes seeing names of people, sometimes not, but that horse's name is always going to be there. But what you are never seeing in race result records would be things like gender, or race, or sometimes even first name. So it's very confounding, time-consuming research. But again, if you have an interest in taking this on locally, we certainly would love to be of assistance with that. So I want to talk about this track, though. Kentucky Association track, the KA track. This track was founded in 1826, again, in what is now the east end of Lexington, Kentucky, and what would have been in that time even considered to be part of like the urban downtown footprint of what was a town that had been around for about 30 years after white settlers moved in, set up a fort, and named it Lexington and claimed it as their own. So, 1826, that puts that track in Lexington as the second racetrack in North America to have a mile-long track on the dirt. This is a very old track. Again, it's why it's a good example of what was happening more broadly. So this track's history and what happened to the neighborhoods and why the neighborhoods evolved around this track after the Civil War as a hub for Black horsemen and their families is critical to today's discussion, okay? So before the Civil War, so for the first 40 years, essentially, this track's existence, this track, the KA, Kentucky Association track, was a leading track in North America. It was known for testing Kentucky breds against other states. And this was a really, really big deal. Racing was this country's pastime. There were no other sports to speak of. And you could go to the races or take in the races in your local paper, whether you were that top 1% that was really wealthy or you were the rest of the world, because we're really kind of before middle class at this point. So testing Kentucky breds against other states was a really, really big deal. And just states kind of having these match races to prove their mettle with families, farm reputations completely on the line throughout much of the 1800s. This was just kind of the reality of horse racing. Transportation wasn't what it is today, although they moved these horses in ways you couldn't even dream of. Even before there was major transit in the form of, say, railroads. So they were getting these horses around this country, but it didn't really pick up steam, literally, until they had a way to en masse transport them in larger quantities. But to have a few races, again, to test that mettle of one state against another was a really big deal. A lot of those races were held at this racetrack. And this racetrack was once surrounded by large farms. So you got downtown Lexington, and you got a little bubble that's still pretty urban, but just wasn't developed because the large horse farms actually were surrounding that track. After the Civil War, this was an undeveloped pocket of land, and really the only undeveloped pocket of land that was that large in the downtown area of Lexington. Local city planners said, okay, where the Civil War's now behind us, emancipation is here, and where are recently freed African Americans and their families going to live? And as you can imagine, it's hard to find minutes where somebody's explicitly stating this, but the sentiment would have been, I have no idea, but I know I don't want it to be by me or in my neighborhood. So undeveloped land, local planners chose that land to buy it from those prior farm owners, divide it into smaller tracts of land, 1/4 an acre to 2 acres, specifically to sell to recently freed slaves. So what does this mean for folks who had spent their entire lives working with horses in a forced labor context after the Civil War? Had an unbelievable skill set, which we'll talk about more. But they also were in a position, because of the vicinity to this racetrack, where you could board and train to maybe with a 1/4 acre of land set up their own racing and breeding operations. So they didn't have to have the capital to buy a large farm, which that capital and those large farms did come. But in those early years, this was seen as many to be a ticket. And that's exactly what happened. The neighborhood around this track after the Civil War, within 10 years, was comprised almost entirely of black horsemen and their families. And while those horsemen were traveling the racing circuit, bringing strings of horses to sell, to run at other tracks across the U.S., occasionally down into the Caribbean, occasionally over into Europe and to Central and South America, what we see is the capacity with a 1/4 acre land to make a really good living for yourself compared to other options in the Reconstruction era, okay? So while the men are traveling the circuit, the women are back home, and they have this growing kind of capital and wealth. You see an establishment of the black middle class in Lexington before you see it in other comparably sized southern towns, largely because of this track and the work in the industry after the Civil War. If there was definitely this sense of, well, if we're shouldering this work 24/7 with all the decades of enslavement, and we have a skill set that doesn't really have a parallel at this moment in time with a young white man counterpart, because that work during enslavement would have been seen by folks wealthy enough to own racehorses as work that was beneath them, then there was definitely a sense of this is marketable. So hundreds of folks went on to set up their own racing and breeding operations in the neighborhoods that surrounded this track. And while they were away traveling that racing circuit, the men that ran those operations, whether they were training, riding, or working as a groom or a farrier, the women in their lives were back home in Lexington's East End. And they were taking some of that money that was made from racing and opening up salons, supply stores, laundry shops, and in an era where women could not legally own property in the state of Kentucky. We have examples of African-American women in Lexington's East End who are buying property in their own names and running establishments on them. It's a pretty phenomenal story. Again, I'd love to know more about what the women were doing when the men were away. We know it was being very clever and very resourceful financially, and in terms of starting small businesses that grew into very large businesses. We also know there was a heavy involvement with the establishment and maintenance of a very rich arts culture, which is still thriving in that community today in Lexington's East End, and the establishment of houses of worship and schools, which were just considered to be stellar for a neighborhood like that in the Reconstruction era in the South. And I'm quoting things that we're calling from newspapers, a neighborhood like that. So, spent a lot of time given that context because that context is so important for what comes next. But nearly all black horsemen, until we get to emancipation, were enslaved. And as enslaved boys, for the most part, and sometimes young men, their folks would go on who trained while enslaved or rode as jockeys while enslaved to become household names, dominating presence in the winner's circle in all these decades leading to the Civil War. And though there aren't many instances in the records of free black jockeys or trainers before emancipation, Harry Lewis, which is featured here in this photograph, in this photograph of a painting in his top hat, was a free black man by 1850. So this was a full 15 years before emancipation. He was a very rare first, at a young age, 7 or 8 years old, jockey to start training in that capacity while enslaved. And by his teenage years, renowned horse trainer. He was able to earn purse money from those wins, which was a common, I think, thread of just kind of dangling this purse money before a young boy who was riding your horse. And why were they boys for the most part? Why were they so young? Whether they were enslaved or they were free black or they were white. Why were jockeys of the era, and really until the 1930s, so young? Because they were small, and you had to make weight to be a jockey then, just like you have to make weight now. So when I'm talking about boys, I do mean young people who were not even had reached adolescence yet, often in these roles. So that's the story that Harry Lewis had, is his life trajectory, was to start off at about 4 or 5 years old as a stable boy, purchased for that exact reason, with a hope from that man who owned horses and owned enslaved trainers and riders and caretakers of horses, to say, there's something, I see something there on that auction block, and I just know that I can cultivate that and make it into, hopefully, a jockey for a few years that's great for our stable. Then they've got this 24/7 kind of experience with a horse. It's all they've known for 10 years, and by the ripe age of 15, maybe I can, move them into a training lens, and then maybe the very, very best of the trainers will become foremen of my entire breeding and racing operations while still enslaved. It's just really, there aren't many parallels of what we're seeing here in the thoroughbred industry and other industries in this period of time. Not only were there not a lot of sports on the scene, there certainly were no integrated sports, okay? Whether that integration was with an enslaved presence or free presence, there was just none, period, all right? With the exception of maybe black boxers in the late 1800s, and we'll talk about that. Black boxers being pushed out of the ring before very lucrative, very visible jobs in racing were systemically pushed out of racing. So, I hope I've made a case for why, if you were a white owner of thoroughbred horses and a white owner of an enslaved workforce that took care of those horses every day and every night for their entire lives, why you might be a little reluctant, even though you're dangling that cash money in front of an enslaved worker. What good is cash really to somebody who's enslaved? It just doesn't hold that same kind of value. The only hope that you're giving that person is that if they stockpile enough of it, that maybe, just maybe one day, I'll let you buy your freedom, okay? Well, the answer, 9 times out of 10, when that money was readily available, is no. You are worth far more to me, because remember, I made you, I cultivated you from this young age, and I fed you, and you know what you know about horses because of me. That was the thinking, okay? So, long story short, very rare for someone to be a free man working in this capacity like Harry Lewis did in 1850. But he did have one of his prior owners finally say, yes, I'll take that cash in hand offer, I'll let you buy your freedom, and that person actually honored that handshake. So Harry Lewis was owned by some of the South's most prominent racehorse owners and breeders. One of the men that he was owned by was Dr. Warfield. And remember when I said that old track was surrounded by horse farms? One of those horse farms was Dr. Warfield's horse farm. Dr. Warfield is credited with breeding the horse named Lexington. If that doesn't ring a bell to you, that's okay. But in our town, it's our town's motto, logo, everything. So the horse Lexington was named after the city Lexington. Our town turned him blue. I don't know why. Don't tell my friends in city council and the mayor's office that I've asked why, but they did. And he is the logo for our city. You will see him in all chamber, all tourism. This horse is it. This horse was top stallion in North America, shaped the breed today. No one ever came close to doing as a sire what this horse did in the late 1800s. So back up to when this horse was foaled. This page that's scanned is from a farm ledger from Dr. Warfield's farm, on that farm that abutted the land of that Kentucky Association track, where Harry Lewis spent some of his years enslaved working with horses. Harry Lewis would have been making the decisions at this point in time about which stallions to breed with which mares. And you see where I've put a box in red. Around 1850 in March, a bay colt was foaled. When this colt was given a name, he was called Darley. Can you see that somebody in pencil put afterward name Lexington? Can you make that out in this scan? Okay. Somebody had the presence of mind to know that they needed to go back into that farm ledger and note this Darley one day became the great Lexington. So Harry Lewis was responsible for the matings on the farm at this time. Harry Lewis also had a contract to train Darley, which is what this horse was called as a 2-year-old, to stellar success. And can you imagine being a young black man at the time, brokering contracts, not with one of your prior owners, but maybe 4 or 5? Again, we're 10 years before the Civil War has even started. So a pretty unbelievable thing is happening here. And then when this horse was 3 and the racing rights were still leased by Harry Lewis, a group of white men came in as a syndicate and bought that horse, and that's when he was called Lexington. They thought his name Darley sounded too British, and they were like, we're not having any of that. We're calling this horse Lexington. That is emblematic of where we want to take this industry moving forward, because the bluegrass was definitely making its presence known on a global map for being able to breed thoroughbreds. So we wouldn't have this blue horse all over the town of Lexington, nor its impacts as a stallion had it not been for Harry Lewis. Someone that I want to talk about too, who would have started off most of his life enslaved working with horses, is Ansel Williamson. Ansel Williamson did not become a free man until later in his life. He was firmly middle-aged, and it was at emancipation. But he set up his shop in Lexington's East End because of the vicinity of that racetrack. And he trained some of the greatest runners of the 19th century, including horses like Asteroid, Norfolk, and the very first winner of the Kentucky Derby was trained by Ansel Williamson. And he was a free man in 1875 and had been for 15 years. Ansel Williamson was one of 4 future U.S. Racing Hall of Famers that lived in Lexington's East End. I'm not aware of another sport in this country that has that much talent in one neighborhood. So the legacy is really, really tremendous. Something certainly to be celebrated. Ansel was known for being very gracious with his unbelievable skill, knowledge, art, and doing his best to pass it down to the next generation, whether they were related by blood or not. He had a lot of experience doing this while enslaved. And when he was free, he took on a lot of apprentices in his home in Lexington. And one of his mentees was Ed Brown, who's featured in this painting as the young jockey. He was just about 10 years old when this painting was commissioned. Ed Brown was sold on Lexington slave auction block when he was 7 years old. He would go on to become one of the wealthiest African Americans in the South. Unlike Ansel, who spent much of his life working with horses enslaved, as I hope this painting depicts, Ed Brown was a full generation younger. So he was much younger at emancipation. He was one of the first Americans to kind of take this concept of maybe finding a 2-year-old racehorse, okay? And this runner is, maybe Ed's watching this horse run, and Ed feels like there's a lot of potential here. Nobody's tapping into this. I'm going to buy this horse at a low price because nobody else sees its value. I'm going to cultivate it for the rest of its 2-year-old season and into its 3-year-old season, and then I'm going to sell it later as a 3-year-old, almost like flipping a horse, all right? And not a lot of people were thinking that way until Ed Brown came around and had great success with it. He also, like Ansel Williamson, apprenticed hundreds of exercise riders, jockeys, trainers out of his Lexington home, and we see their names in census records as apprentices in formal apprenticeships outside of that home, or based out of that home, rather. Interestingly, Ed Brown's house still stands. If you're ever in Lexington and you want to go to a great bakery in Lexington's East End, it's called Martine's. Right behind Martine's is Ed Brown's house. It still stands with a Bluegrass Trust marker on his home. Gets me emotional sometimes. Okay, so by the late 1800s, across the South, what you see in this photo would not have been uncommon. Most racing stables, owned by either black or white horsemen, were comprised almost entirely of black horsemen at every level for roughly 30 to 40 years following the Civil War. So exercise riders, jockeys, grooms, trainers, foremen, you name it, this would have been a racing stable of choice. You can see in the center is the trainer who's paying this staff. He happens to be a white trainer, but I could show you other photos with similar stables owned by black men as well. I want to talk about some of those jockeys and some of those folks operating in this period after the Civil War, but before 1900. Oliver Lewis, he wins the very first Kentucky Derby. There were 15 horses in the Derby in 1875 when it was first run. If you all had to guess how many of those horses were ridden by black jockeys, what would you guess? 13. So 13 of 15 were piloted by black jockeys. Again, I think that speaks to just how common it was, the sheer dominance of such a small percentage of the population having such a strong presence in the saddle and training, not to mention the 24/7 care of the horses as farriers and grooms and hot walkers and exercise riders. The first 28 Kentucky Derby runnings, 16 of those 28 races were won by horses ridden by black jockeys. Keep that rich history of black jockeys and trainers in mind in the Kentucky Derby when we get much further along in this story, because I want to come back to it. So, Billy Walker, another one of the early Derby winners, he won in 1877. He was 15 years old when he won. He would go on after he retired from racing to train his own horses. He also wrote under a pen name and was like a turf writer of the time, which was new in general, especially new for a young black man. He also was Hamburg Stud's pedigree analyst. Now, John Madden was the white man who owned Hamburg Stud in the years after the Civil War. Hamburg Stud was one of the most prolific breeding operations in North America, and in all those years where John Madden's Hamburg Stud is topping North American breeder year after year after year, this is the man John Madden is paying to make decisions about pedigrees and which stallions and mares are going to be paired with each other. Does anyone recognize this face? Maybe one of the most recognizable faces in racing history. This is Isaac Murphy. Isaac Murphy was one of those 4 future Hall of Famers that lived in Lexington's East End. And no one ever, anywhere, has ever come close to matching his winning percentage of about 40%. And that was sustained over a 20-year career in this saddle. So basically, Isaac Murphy won almost half the time he was in the saddle, and he finished in the money about 3/4 of the time. To give you a point of comparison, Hall of Fame jockeys today, I mean, a great winning percentage to have would be, 15 to 25%. That's considered to be very stellar. And Isaac Murphy was going for 20 years with closer to 40%. I love this painting because this is the very first American Derby. This was a really, really big race based out of Chicago's Washington Park. And the very first time it was run, its first, second, third place finishers were all ridden by black jockeys. Isaac Murphy happened to win on the filly that day, and he would go on to win 4 more American Derbies, 4 Latonia Derbies, another really prestigious race, and 3 Kentucky Derbies. To give you a sense of the kind of money that Isaac Murphy was able to broker in his contracts with his clients, in 1 year, he had one contract with one client that was $10,000. Now, this was in the same year where the top 1% of Americans were making about $1,500 annually. This was one of his contracts with one of his clients in one season. And all that contract was, it was with a man named Lucky Baldwin, who is a white man who made his money and who knows all sorts of maybe kind of unsavory ways in the West, but he claimed it was through mineral mining and real estate, and much of it was. But Lucky Baldwin was a character, and he really had enough money that he liked to throw it around. So him taking up this contract with Isaac Murphy was a statement about what he could afford. And what that contract was if Isaac was riding at a track anywhere where Lucky Baldwin had a horse running that day, that Isaac would ride Lucky Baldwin's horse before he rode anyone else's. So it didn't even matter the outcome of the race. That's what that contract was for. And if you ever want to know more about Lucky Baldwin, please ask. There were multiple attempts on his life. There were a few women who tried to kill Lucky Baldwin. One was on the witness stand and said it was her Christian duty to remove this man from the planet Earth while on the witness stand. She shot, but she did not kill Lucky Baldwin. Fascinating life there. But back to Isaac Murphy. His home in Lexington, he had a lot of property, but his primary home where his wife lived, named Lucy, it had a rooftop observatory that overlooked that racetrack in Lexington's East End. They were pillars of their community, countless wakes, weddings, race day parties were hosted in Isaac and Lucy's home. He died very young, in his mid-30s. And when he died, the town of Lexington threw him a funeral that the city had never seen in terms of size before and hasn't seen since. A true hero of the turf. This painting captures another jockey. His name was Shelby Pike Barnes. This was the very first jockey to ever get more than 200 wins in a single racing season anywhere in North America. He was top jockey in North America in 1888 and 1889. And in a few of his seasons, he kind of came close to Isaac Murphy's winnings percentage. He just didn't sustain it over his whole career. Willie Sims, this is the only black jockey to ever win every leg of what is now America's Triple Crown. But when pressures against black horsemen, especially jockeys and trainers, who were the people who could make the most money, made the most headlines, and have the most stature, but when those pressures against those folks, the biggest earners, the most successful, the most seen by the public, the closer we get to 1900 and to the beginnings of the Jim Crow era, the more and more we see local racing jurisdictions across the country systemically push out black riders, black trainers, and black owners. So many jockeys, like Willie Sims, went overseas. They took, but you could only go overseas if you had those kind of resources. So it wasn't an option for everyone, but it was an option for some of the jockeys that had done well for themselves and had the money to be able to afford to do that. Jimmy Wingfield is a great example of another black horseman of the late 1800s, and in his case, early 1900s, who left this country so he could continue to do what he did best. He wins back-to-back Kentucky Derbies in 1901 and 1902. Is considered to be one of the top riders in North America. By 1903, he's having trouble just getting a mount anywhere on any horse as Jim Crow just gains a tighter and tighter grip on our society. So Jimmy Wingfield goes to Europe. He was a very favorite of the Russian Tsar. He had tremendous success in Germany and Poland and Austria and Italy before he made it to Russia. The Tsar loved racing. The Tsar loved Jimmy Wingfield. And Jimmy Wingfield was in Russia at the breakout of the Russian Revolution. So once again, Jimmy Wingfield finds himself on a challenging side of history. So Jimmy Wingfield, they literally have to flee Russia from the mob that is going after the aristocracy. And anybody associated with it, and Jimmy Wingfield was certainly associated with it. So Wingfield took a group of about 200 horses, some nobility of Polish families, and horsemen and their families, and they left Russia by foot, headed to Poland. That is a more than 1,000-mile journey. Most of them made it. There are 2 books written on Jimmy Winkfield's life. Jimmy Winkfield was already a celebrated athlete when he made it to Poland. He was a national hero by the time they made that trek. There's a couple mountain ranges between Russia and Poland as well, and they've come across, villages where they were fired upon by locals and the mob, because nobody necessarily knew who they were, and they looked like a force because they were coming in with horses. So if you want book recommendations on Jimmy's life, please see me after the talk, and I'll give them to you. After he made it to Poland, then he faces 2 world wars. He eventually sets up shop in France, and that is where he kept his training stable. And he lived a very, very long life. Jimmy Winkfield's daughter, one of his daughters, still lived in northern Kentucky until she died last year. She was 101. Her daughter is a thoroughbred horse vet based out of Louisiana, who routinely brings her clients to Keeneland for the sales. Dr. Amy Casey, fantastic woman who's also now in retirement. So we mentioned this earlier, but other than boxing, keep in mind, no other integrated sports in this country until the civil rights movement. Well, that happened almost 100 years after the rise of black horsemen after emancipation in 1865. But those years following emancipation until about 1900, black horsemen, whether they were household names, celebrities, or they were simply making a good living on the backside on horse farms, were forging a way for themselves and their families. But I would have to think that if you were doing this work, whether you were the person doing that work or you were in the family of the person doing that work, for all those years, you'd have to feel like you were living in a bubble that was going to burst at any time, right? So how long is this establishment of racing going to tolerate African Americans who were second-class citizens everywhere else, dominating the sport and being considered heroes of the turf? The closer we get to 1900, the more pronounced we see this barring of black horsemen from the highest and most visible jobs. So what did that look like? It looked like violence on and off the track. It looked like you showed up to your local racing office to get your jockey's license, your trainer's license, or you were at a sale, or you simply wanted to buy a horse or sell a horse, and you were black and you'd been doing this for a long, long time. And all of a sudden, that day is just the day where you hear, oh, we don't have, our numbers are cut, and we don't have as many licenses to go around. And yeah, I don't think we're going to be buying and selling anymore. So look at the difference between this photo taken in 1891 and this photo taken in 1908. So we're talking about 17 years. That's not an insignificant amount of time, all right? But in the scheme of history, it's just a blink of an eye. What are some differences you see between these 2 photographs? Number. In this shot, about 40% of the jockeys that just randomly came out to have their picture taken, something that was weird and new at a racetrack back in 1890. This wasn't common to have cameras at tracks. It was just taking off at this time. So it wouldn't have been the most comfortable thing in the world to do to begin with. And they're just getting their picture taken, just whoever decided to be in the shot. I see a lot of touching. Yeah, so we have about 40% of the jockeys in this photograph are black. This picture was taken up in New York. We see Isaac Murphy with his fierce competitor, Snapper Garrison's hand on his shoulder. We see Shelby Pike Barnes. We've got Lonnie Clayton in the bottom. We've got Willie Sims before he left for Europe. We've got Chippy Ray up top. Again, I think there's a lot of touching. This is not a team. These are all individual competitors. Then we have this photo. Well, for starters, we have one black jockey left in this shot, right? This is Jimmy Lee. He truly was the last black jockey competing at this level. He wins the Travers Stakes. He wins the Kentucky Oaks. One day at Churchill in June of 1907, he won every race on the card that day. That's never happened at Churchill since. And he was truly the last black jockey to be competing at this level. I don't know how Jimmy Lee did it. and sustain the violence and was able to get licensed, sure, but he did. I also see a lot of people touching each other on the right, but nobody touching Jimmy Lee. I think those photos are very emblematic of what we all know was the decades that followed until we get, not just to the civil rights movement, but ongoing issues today, right? So, I said this earlier, I want to repeat it. I know we're getting close on time. This is where most people stop telling this story, all right? Despite the thousands of men and later women who continue to work with horses every day for their lives and in a multi-generational, often, context. So I don't want to silence stories that have already been silenced. So we're not stopping this story at Jim Crow. We're bringing it through. So the reality was that if it was early 1900s and you worked with horses, you had a few options. You could continue to work with horses on the backside of racetracks or on farms where no one saw you or cared anymore about the fact that of your race. You could leave racing, horse industry entirely, move north into these growing industrial hubs. Or if you were very privileged and some of the elite few moved to Europe. Most people stayed, especially because of the communities, like what we see in Lexington's East End as emblematic of other communities. This is where their families, their support structure, their entire life was, and working with horses is what was simply known. And most people continue to do that as grooms, farriers, backside workers at tracks. These photos, by the way, are taken at tracks across the country. Occasionally, this would have been considered to be a very prestigious job, a jockey valet. And I know it's a strange way we pronounce it in the industry, but this photograph was taken up in Saratoga Springs. Again, this would have been considered to be a pretty premier job, very rare for a young black man to hold. Exercise riders, this photo was taken here in Florida, not here though, but down at Hialeah. And this shot, what you don't see in this shot is that it's in a grouping of a lot of other photos in a collection that were taken after desegregation, but even after desegregation, in some of the photos you can see in the background, signs that say "No Negroes After Dark." So "No Negroes After Dark" posted on signage at a Florida track after desegregation when the majority of the backside workforce was African American. Stallion managers, broodmare managers, although they probably wouldn't have had that title, and they certainly weren't making the pay of their white counterparts. I do want to point out a few of the stallion managers. This is John Buckner on Man o' War. Can you imagine running your stallions like this? A stallion manager today doesn't typically get on the stallions in his or her charge. But John Buckner did, and he took care of Man o' War and the other stallions on that farm for 10 years before Will Harbit came on the scene. And Will Harbit would make headlines for the first time in a long time as a black man working with horses. Just with his bond with that horse in particular and all the stallions under his care are just, I think, forever imprinted on the industry record and our country's collective memory. Not this picture, but a picture really close. It was taken the same day. It made the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. We can finally start talking about women because regardless of race or ethnicity, women didn't usually make it as trainers, and they were not legally allowed to ride as jockeys until the late 1960s. So Sylvia Bishop becomes the first black woman to get a trainer's license in this country at a time when most black men could not. She started training horses about 10 years before desegregation. She was one of 17 children based out of West Virginia. Oscar Dishman, he's a Kentuckian. Not only was Oscar a prolific black trainer, he was also a political activist and was largely responsible for the desegregation of Scott County Public Schools. That's a school system in Kentucky, one of the first in the country to be desegregated. Cheryl White, you can learn more about Cheryl upstairs, the first black woman. She was only 17 years old to make history, to ride and win in this country. She did that in 1971, just 2 years after women could legally ride a racehorse in this country. 17. And the media descended upon her in her tiny town in Ohio like a storm. She carried it with so much grace and so much dignity, because not only was she representing women, she was also representing an entire race, and she's doing this at 17-year-old and trying to keep up her studies. She was an extremely gifted student and very committed. She died a few years ago on a racetrack as working as a steward, very close to where she was raised and where she won that first race. I love this photo, 1978. Does anybody want to guess where this photo was taken? It wasn't Florida, but it was another big pocket of racing in the South. It was Louisiana, actually. Yeah, and so 1978, I think no surprise with the hair, right? I love this photo. So the jockey that is in like those yellow and black silks at the bottom left, he's third generation jockey. His son rides today. And that is Sylvester Carmouche, by the way. I don't think I named him. Sylvester Carmouche is the jockey on the bottom left. If you want to know all the jockeys' names, get with me and I can share that with you. So, remember I said we'd come back to that Kentucky Derby history, where so much of it was won by the skill of black athletes and trainers in its early years. Marlon St. Julian, this picture was taken at Keeneland. Marlon St. Julian won his first stakes race at Keeneland in 1999. But when he had a mount in the 2000 Kentucky Derby, he was the first black jockey to have a mount in that race in almost 80 years. He had leading titles at tracks in Louisiana, Texas, Kentucky. He had a strong presence here in Florida as well in some of his racing years in the late 90s, early 2000s. I told you we'd talk about Sylvester's son, Kendrick. This is Kendrick. Kendrick just won the George Wolfe Memorial Award this year, the most prestigious award you can win as a jockey. It's voted on by your peers. The last time I checked Kendrick's career earnings, he was beyond $160 million. I think Kendrick's doing pretty well for himself. He's also an amazing ambassador for that sport, and that smile is pretty much, it's almost never not there. Very charismatic. Anybody notice anything about Deshaun Parker? Does anything stand out to you about Deshaun? And maybe his age, I don't think it stands out, but I'll just tell you, he's in his early 50s. So the fact that he's still riding in his early 50s is unbelievable. He's also tall. Can you make that out in this photo? He's 5'11". So 5'11", decides as a young black man in the 80s that I'm going to ride racehorses, and I'm going to do it at my height. Unbelievable. Now, his story speaks to this multi-generational theme that we see threaded throughout Heart of the Turf. It comes down to exposure. His father was the first black racing official at Midwestern tracks in the U.S., so the life was all that Deshaun knew. And despite everything he tried to not work in the sport, he ended up being a part of the sport and dominating it. This is when he won the George Wolfe Memorial Award a few years back. In 2022, Deshaun became one of only 20 jockeys anywhere in the world to surpass 6,000 career wins. He did that at his height and in his early 50s. This is the last person I'm going to talk about, Greg Harbit. Does that name ring a bell? Harbit? Will Harbit, who we spoke of earlier, the stallion manager out at Faraway Farm with Man o' War and others. This is his great-grandson. Greg Harbit's trainer, his father was a trainer. Greg is a bloodstock agent. Greg also brought a horse to the 2020 Kentucky Derby with business partners. Greg Harbit also runs a syndicate of folks so that if you want to have a stake in the industry and you can't afford to own a horse on your own, you buy a share of a horse with a lot of people. Syndicates have been around for a long time. They're really popular and having increasing popularity in the last 15 to 20 years. So Greg Harbert runs one of those syndicates. It's specifically for minority owners. He also is a co-founder of a nonprofit called the Ed Brown Society, named after Ed Brown, whose house still stands in Lexington's East End. And that whole nonprofit's mission is to place young people of color in applied positions in the industry, regardless of what they want to do in the industry, whether they want to work with horses and accounting and communications. We had an Ed Brown fellow at the library who was with us for a summer before he moved to California to pursue his PhD. Pretty amazing work that Ed Brown Society is doing with Greg Harbert at the helm. So even though I talked a lot about jockeys today, please do take time to explore the exhibit, where you're going to find stories of farriers, backside workers, farm managers, owners, breeders, all the types of roles that make this global industry tick and move forward. And if you have any questions, the exhibit companion book is available in the shop. It's also available online at this URL as a flip book. Everything that's in the exhibit and more is packed into this almost like a magazine type binding. We kept it like that intentionally to keep the cost down so we could get it into as many homes and classrooms as possible. Heart of the Turf so far has been taken in by 225,000 children and adults in 7 states so far. So thank you, Florida, for being our 7th state. And for helping us take these stories to folks who may not have an opportunity to even think about this, let alone learn more about such an important part of our country's history and present. Any questions for me, even though I'm over?
Yes, we actually have a question from our Zoom audience. They were wondering if you could speak to the accuracy of Geraldine Brooks' book, Horse, and its depiction of race relations.
Yes. So Geraldine Brooks conducted her research at Keeneland Library, like pretty much any other book or article that touches on the industry. And of course, when we're working with folks, everything's confidential. So it wasn't until almost 12 years later in the book's imminent release that we can talk about Geraldine Brooks and the fact that we worked with her on her research. So there are some core elements of Horse, which is historic fiction, which are factual. There was that horse Lexington, who our city turned blue. And that horse did have that presence with Harry Lewis. And you see Dr. Warfield's daughter in that book, the fact that his daughter would go on to lead the suffrage movement in Kentucky, and that her daughters would lead the women's suffrage movement across the country. That spirit that you see in this character in the book, that's all true. But the character who was created to travel with Lexington is a fictitious character. But certainly based on what reality would have been like for the enslaved boys and men charged with taking care of those horses. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
I think I saw another hand.
Yes.
The people who were buying and selling horses, obviously, were they literate? Were they financially literate?
Which period of time? Before we get to 1900, after?
Before 1900, immediately post-Civil War era.
Yes. And are we talking about the African Americans working in the sport? Yes. The financial literacy certainly was there. Again, in one little corner of the world's community of Lexington's East End, on full display, and somehow circumnavigating the laws to legally have a property in your name as a woman. So the diversification of wealth was something that we read about quite extensively in those firsthand accounts. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot that has survived in the way of firsthand accounts. So what we're getting would be what somebody else in that period of time is writing about someone's life, or what somebody else after that period of time is going back and conducting historic research to write a historic feature on a person or a place. So a lot of what we have to work with are secondary sources. But yes, that financial literacy was absolutely there. And the knowledge of the horse would have, again, it really didn't have a parallel in the white universe. You didn't call a vet if your horse had issues. Is that 4-year-old stable boy or that 13-year-old jockey who's riding that horse and feels like something's off, but particularly the groom, who probably knows that horse better than anyone else, not probably, definitely, would have had the science, the art, the aptitude. It's just such a nuanced, rich skill set, knowledge base. And until white men of the upper class began to work with horses in a way that they never had before, because an enslaved workforce did that work, there was really no parallel in the southern white world for that knowledge and that expertise of the horses. So in terms of that knowledge of the trade and the daily work, yeah, it was not just there, it was there in a huge way.
How much did the tall guy weigh? The 5'11" guy?
It's same as everybody else having to make weight. So the weight that you have to make as a jockey is dependent on the race, because some races have weights involved in them. Some don't have quite as much in the way of restrictions, like down to 1/2 pound, but there still are always weight restrictions, because legally a horse can only carry so much weight, and that includes the other things that the horse is carrying, the tack, and the equipment that jockey is wearing. So as a rule, if you exceed 110 pounds, you're going to have a hard time making it as a jockey.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much. This has been extremely informative. I wanted to know if you could, you used a specific word. You said, I think it was after the 1900s, how blacks started systemically being pushed out of the race. Can you give an example of what that systemic push out looked like, or maybe even contextualize it in the broader U.S. history?
Well, and I'm happy you asked that question, because it never took the form of a law necessarily as it related specifically to racing. It was more of a de facto at that local racing jurisdiction. So there is no national body at this time, right, that's regulating this in any way. Every local jurisdiction has their own set of laws, bylaws, people on their commission who are overseeing and enforcing those laws, granting licensure to jockeys, exercise riders, trainers. Those are 3 roles where licensure is required in a way that sometimes other roles aren't required at this period of time. So those local racing jurisdictions just simply stopped doing it. There would not have been a memo sent. There wasn't a law on the books, other than the segregation laws that made racetracks segregated facilities. The fact that a racetrack was a segregated facility didn't, by law, prohibit the involvement of, say, black jockeys or trainers. But again, we had talked earlier about feeling like maybe that bubble was about to burst. So you're coming onto a sport that still has a major stronghold on this country's kind of consciousness and is a pastime for many. And you're entering a facility that is segregated if you're in the South. But you're going to go to that segregated facility and watch black jockeys dominating the winner's circle? Probably not terribly likely. So the systematic part of that, what I meant by that was the violence that, and what we see was, it was on and off the track, where young black riders were targeted in their hotels, were targeted in the jockeys' quarters, were targeted mid-race, with all those horses running at that speed, where white riders would box in black riders against the rail. Anything can happen. Anything can happen at that time. Whether you're white, black, regardless of who that horse is, whether you were the person doing the boxing in or not, anything could happen. And I think that violence was especially a turning point. That again, no memo, no official decree, but now when my horse's safety is on the line, maybe I'm not going to continue to contract, so we can just get this violence and this sense of insecurity off the racetracks, and everyone will be the safer for it. So it's that kind of thinking, I think, that rationale. Okay, thank you all so much. And I don't know how long the room is available, but I'm here to answer questions as long as the room